not remind me. I told you to remind me, right? I'm mentally docking you guys. Every one of you are getting dock points for not reminding me. All right. So yeah, here's our Zoom meeting information. Where our class hours in general, we're going to try to stick to 9 to 11 in the mornings. Of course, that's going to be when we meet in person, and then 12:30 to 2. We might go a little bit beyond that today because we had a truncated class this morning, so I apologize for that. Office hours, you can usually talk to me after morning class, but I'm also happy to set up other times. Once again, send me an email and we can set up times to talk. The text, hopefully you've all had an ability to get the text either in person or get the online version of it. Krugman and Wells, it should be pretty widely available. You can get it on Amazon or a number of other places. If you get a 4th edition, that's okay with me too, right? It doesn't have to be the 4th edition, but just be aware that there's going to be some differences, but in general, the differences are small. If you need help with quantitative reasoning, this is a quantitative literacy course, so we are going to be understanding quantitative data, and that's an important part of what economics is about. If you ever need help, you can always get some tutoring from the Quantitative Resource Studio, also the Writing Studio. Here's the link where you can set up an appointment if you need help with writing. We are going to have one short writing assignment in this class that we'll talk about. I think I've said everything I need to say about the modality of the course and how we're going to run it, but you can read this again. And this morning we talked about the intro to macro stuff. The learning objectives for this course really relate exactly to the learning objectives that Cornell College has set up. So the keys to this course is to develop the ability to analytically think and to critically think in terms of economic models, to develop our quantitative reasoning skills, to better understand current issues in economics and public policy, and also to improve our written communication skills. So those are going to be the big objectives, learning objectives that we have in this class. Let's talk a little bit about grading and how your course grade will be determined. The first part of this is going to be exams. So we're going to have 2 midterms and a final exam. In between that, we're also going to have 5 quizzes. So basically what's going to happen is for these first 3 weeks, every other day, you're going to be taking either a quiz or an exam, okay? So basically on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you can expect to be taking a quiz or an exam. So for instance, tomorrow morning, we will take a quiz, right? It's going to be a 20-minute quiz. And the purpose of these quizzes, quite honestly, is to get you ready for the exams. So you'll take a quiz on Tuesday, you'll take a quiz on Thursday. Next Tuesday will be your first exam. Then you have next Thursday will be a 3rd quiz. 4th quiz would be the 3rd Tuesday. Your 2nd exam is going to be the 3rd Thursday. And then the last week's a little bit different. But so in other words, there's going to be a lot of feedback in this class. And really the purpose of these quizzes, as I said, is to give you feedback, to give you practice for the exams, right? They are basically mini exams. And so it's a good way to test where you are and to make sure that you're understanding the material that you'll need to understand for the 3 exams. We're also going to have a short paper that's going to be due the last week of class. I won't talk much about this now, but we'll talk about this later. It's basically kind of a current events paper where you can use what you've learned in this class to write about that. And then class participation will also count for 30 points. And class participation is more than just showing up, but it's also coming prepared to ask questions, to answer questions, to engage your classmates, right? And so I realize some of this is going to be difficult given that some of us are here, some of us are online, some of us are all going to be online at times, and Zoom is awkward. You know, we're going to do the best that we can, right? We're going to do the best that we can with this, but I am going to expect to see some engaged participation from all of you. Unexcused absences will reduce your class participation, right? So if you need to miss class, you need to talk to me about it, right? So just don't miss class and don't tell me, or that will be an unexcused absence. Of course, you know, if you do have to miss class, there's going to be lots of opportunities for you to get on the class via Zoom. And, you know, if you do miss class and it's excused, you can always catch up on the Zoom links that I share with you in which I record the lectures. Here's the typical comment on academic dishonesty. It won't be tolerated, right? This is really pretty standard stuff. I have this little thing about not using the bathrooms during quizzes and exams. Just get my permission, right? It's not out loud, just get my permission. Learning disabilities. I do know that a couple of you, I've received a couple of letters from the tutoring office about those of you who have recognized learning disabilities, disabilities that are recognized by the college and that you are getting accommodations. So please talk with me as soon as possible if you do have accommodations, and how, so that we can begin a conversation as to how exactly we're going to manage these in this class. So for those of you who do want an accommodation, just please come talk to me as quickly as possible. And then cell phones, I don't want cell phones in class, right? Particularly in-person class. I can't regulate you when you're not in class, but I don't want to see cell phones in class. Also, cell phones are not going to be allowed to be used as calculators. So bring calculators, right? For your quizzes and for your exams, bring calculators. You cannot use your cell phones. And also, I would like to have your permission if you're going to be using your computer in the classroom. That's not to say that it's not allowed, but I would just like to have a brief conversation with you. Basically, I don't want computers in the classroom to become a distraction, as they often can if you kind of do the surfing thing while I'm talking. Finally, here's the outline of readings. And we will stick to this very, very carefully, right? I've kind of would like to think that I've gotten this course down to a science. My science is probably messed up this block in that we have so many students that are in person and a big chunk that are not in person. And then, of course, the other big complication to all of this is the weather. And so I live in Iowa City, and so it's not, if there are weather issues, it might preclude me coming to class. It's possible that we would lose time. Probably not likely, given we can always meet by Zoom. But anyway, we will follow this schedule very closely. So if you don't know what we're doing on a particular day, you can look at this. This also has the dates of our quizzes and our exams, right? So you can see that quiz number 1 is going to be tomorrow morning. Quiz number 2, Thursday morning. And we will have the quizzes and the exams in the mornings. Okay, that's going to be our schedule. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about any of that? About any of the logistics of the course? Okay, well, hearing none, let's go back and talk about supply and demand, right? The conversation that we kind of ran out of. Well, we didn't run out of time. We just had our technical issues this morning. So let's go back and get back into this if we can, talking about supply and demand. So if you remember where we kind of lost touch. Okay, so we were talking about the law of demand, right? So remember, we started with this demand schedule about what my relationship between the price of beer is and the quantity of beer that I drink. And then we turned this demand schedule into a demand curve, right? Which is basically a visual representation of what we found in the demand schedule. And the key to this demand curve is this idea of ceteris paribus, meaning everything else being equal. So everything else, whether it's the price of substitutes, whether it's the price of complements, we'll talk about what those are in a minute, whether it's your income, all of those things are being held constant. And the only thing that's changing is the price of beer. And so what do we typically find for demand curves? That they're downward sloping. In other words, quantity demanded falls as the price rises. And so why might that be? And we talked this morning about 2 reasons. The income effect, which is at a fixed income, you just simply don't have as much money to buy as many units of the good when the price goes up. Okay, so if I've got $50 and the price of beer goes up, that is going to reduce the number of beers I can buy with that $50. But there's also another reason, and in many ways, I think a more powerful reason why demand curves are downward sloping, and this is the substitution effect. which is when price goes up, people switch to cheaper substitutes. Okay, when the price goes up, people switch to cheaper substitutes. So what happens when there's a freeze in Florida and the orange crop gets destroyed? Well, the price of orange juice goes up. How do many people respond to that? When the price goes up, people buy less orange juice and they switch to something else, whether it's apple juice, grapefruit juice, or, Sunny Delight, which supposedly has some orange juice in it, but I think that's unlikely. So anyway, right? So people are sensitive to prices, right? Now, obviously, the extent of the substitution effect differs upon what kind of good it is. And what if there's good substitutes for the good. So as we talked about this morning, if you're talking about the Moderna COVID vaccine, there's not really a lot of viable substitutes for it, right? But if you're talking about something like a Diet Coke, well, then there's a lot of potential substitutes for it. So, anyway, the extent to which the income effect and the substitution effect differ across goods means that demand curves for different kinds of goods will look differently. But the key is that they will always be downward sloping, right? And that's why we call it the law of demand, because we expect this always to be true, that when the price of the good goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. Now, here's the thing. What about those other things that we've been holding constant? What about those things other than price? Changes in these things shift the demand curve. They shift the demand curve, okay? And we call this a change in demand. Okay? So a change in demand is when you have something other than price that changes, which shifts the demand curve. What are some of these things? Well, there's a number of things that could potentially shift the demand curve. In other words, there's a number of things that could change demand other than a change in price. For instance, one of the things we've talked about is a change in income. What happens if my income rises? All right. So Cornell gives me a big pay raise, haha. And now I'm just loaded, right? What's going to happen to my demand for beer? Well, I'm going to just kind of flip back here. But here's my old demand schedule. But let's say now my income goes up. Right? So now my income has risen. Now, at a price of $1, I'm going to buy 15 beers. And a price of $2, maybe I'll buy 12 beers. And a price of $3, maybe I'll buy 9. At $4, maybe I'll buy 6. $5, I'll buy 3. And at $6, I'll buy 2, right? I'm just buying more beer at every price now. At every price, I'm going to buy more because my income's gone up. So how do I represent this graphically? Well, graphically, without actually sketching this out, This has increased my demand curve. This is an increase in demand. Right? An increase in demand shifts that demand curve out to the right. And so in other words, at every price here, notice now I want to buy more beer. Right? At every price now I want to buy more beer. So you have to think about it this way. When there's a change in something other than price, the old demand curve essentially disappears, and now you have a completely new demand curve. Right? You have a completely new demand curve. So what happens if my income rises? The way that you would graph this, this will do it in red, is that if this is my old demand curve, here is my new demand curve. It's shifted to the right to denote that I want to buy more beer. Now, there's a slight caveat to this, right? That not all goods respond to a change in income in the same way. I've been talking about beer as if it's what we call a normal good. Okay? In other words, when the income goes up, the demand for it goes down. But that's not true for every single good. There are also what are called inferior goods. And an inferior good is that when income goes up, you actually buy less of it. Anybody have any guesses? Or not just guesses, but what would be an inferior good? If you guys won the lottery, what would you buy less of?
Like less ramen, maybe?
Ramen, exactly. That's probably the first word that come out of my mouth too, right? You buy less ramen, you buy less macaroni and cheese, right? You probably would ride the bus less, right? I mean, you would probably shop at the thrift store less, right? You go to Walmart less. So there's, in any economy, there's actually quite a few goods that are inferior goods that you would buy less of. However, most goods, we tend to think about most goods as normal goods, right? In other words, when the income goes up, the demand for it goes up. So that's one of the things that could change your demand curve, is if there's a change in income. Let's talk about a couple of other things here. Something else that could definitely impact demand is the change in the price of other goods. The change in the price of other goods. The most obvious would be of substitutes, right? What happens if there's an increase in the price of a substitute? What's that going to do to the demand for the good you're talking about?
Decrease.
So if the price of the substitute goes up, it gets more expensive, then we want to buy less. No.
I mean, is it not a substitute because the price was lower?
No. So think about it this way. We're talking about the demand for beer here, right? So what happens if the price of wine goes up? Probably people are going to buy less wine, more beer. So we would expect demand to rise. When the price of substitutes go up, people are going to buy less of those other goods and more of our good. Okay? So what happens if the price, of iPhones go up, right? If the price of iPhones go up, you would expect there to be an increase in the demand for Google phones, right? To the extent that you consider the Google phone a substitute. Now, some people will say, I don't consider it a substitute, I'll pay any price, right? But some people are likely to consider it a substitute. There's also another kind of good that could impact, and that's what we call complements. A complement is a good that goes with another good. If there's an increase in the price of a complement, then you would expect there to be a decrease in demand. So let's switch our example here. Let's talk about the market for cereal, right? And there's the demand for cereal and the quantity of cereal. What's going to happen if there's an increase in the price of milk? Well, maybe some of you eat cereal plain. I didn't see who spoke up. Somebody speak up?
It was me.
Okay, yeah, sure. What do you think is going to happen to demand for cereal?
It would decrease, or it would shift to the left.
Right, it's correct. Right. So, I mean, some of us might just eat cereal plain. I'm not against that. But in general, you eat it with milk. So if milk becomes more expensive, you're going to buy less milk. You're probably also going to want to buy less cereal. So in that case, we'd expect the demand for cereal to go down. Okay. Oftentimes there's just a change in what we could call usefulness, or people's taste for goods can also change over time. In this COVID era, give me an example of something that there has been an increase in demand for because of COVID.
Masks.
Hand sanitizer.
Masks, hand sanitizer, right?
Toilet paper.
Yes, I see that Costco is no longer rationing toilet paper. So that means that we're almost done with this crisis. We've gotten through the worst, people. You can now buy as much toilet paper. Why exactly toilet paper? The demand for toilet paper has been gone up. That's an excellent question. Maybe people are hoarding it. I don't know. But yeah, these are things that we'd expect there to be an increase in demand for. What are some things that maybe demand has gone down for because of COVID?
Concert tickets, maybe. I don't know, like events that people can't really go to anymore.
Yeah, right. Anything social. Gas, right? Because people are driving less. I mean, we could sit around here and name a whole bunch of things. But yeah, either the usefulness goods or in some sense the taste for goods can change over time too, which can definitely shift demand. Another thing is a change in the number of buyers. So sometimes goods will see a change in the number of buyers simply because of changes in the real world, right? So, for instance, we have an aging population, more retired people. Once again, that's probably increasing the demand for some goods, and it's reducing the demand for other goods. Any ideas? What's something that the demand for is rising because of our aging population?
Adult diapers.
Adult diapers. Exactly. And what's going down because of our aging population?
Sporting equipment.
Sporting equipment. I'll tell you one that impacts us either directly or indirectly is college education, right? This is one of the things that many colleges and universities are struggling with, is because there's changing demographics. We actually have a older population and fewer kids, particularly in the Midwest, fewer kids that are in that college going age. And so this has actually led to a crunch for many colleges, as they just see that there's not as big a population of college age kids right now. So, these are some of the things that you got to understand, right? And this is not an inclusive list. I'm sure we could think of other things that could shift demand for specific goods, but these are just some of the more, how should I say, more obvious things. The biggest confusion in this, and whether you have to put a star next to this or write it in a different color, right? But for your notes, you really want to pay attention to this. The biggest confusion that students also often have in dealing with demand is to distinguish between a change in demand versus a change in quantity. A change in quantity demanded. What is a change in quantity demanded? It is a change in price. A change in price leads to a change in quantity demanded, and it is a movement along our demand curve. I apologize, you hear that little squeaking noise? My dog is sleeping next to me and having a bad dream, so if you hear something screaming, it's nobody is actually being killed. My dog is just chasing a squirrel in her dreams. Okay, so a change in quantity demanded is a change in price, meaning it's a movement along the demand curve. So when we have a demand curve like this, what happens as price goes up? As price goes up, we move from one point to the next on our demand curve. That is a change in quantity demanded. Okay, and this exact wording is important. You might say, well, what's the difference between change in demand and change in quantity demanded? It's just a word. No, it's important to clearly distinguish this, because a change in quantity demanded means that price has changed. What's a change in demand? It's a change in something else. It's a change in income, or the price of complements, or the price of substitutes. And it is a shift in our demand curve. It's a shift in our demand curve. So how do we draw this? How do we graph this? This would be in our demand curve shifting up or shifting down, depending upon what the exact example is. So when you think about different markets, you have to clearly distinguish between what is changing. Is it price that is changing, or is it something else that's changing, which then drives the change in price? Okay. And as we work through a couple of examples, my hope is that we'll see why making this distinction is so important, right? As when we get to the point where we can work through a couple of examples, I think you'll see some examples of why this is so important. Okay, so those are the mechanics of demand, right? Which is half of our market. Now we got to move on to talking about supply. And just like demand summarizes the actions of buyers, supply summarizes the actions of producers. So, how much beer will producers produce? Well, once again, just like demand, it depends on a bunch of things. It depends on price, obviously, because a higher price increases the profit opportunities for producers. But there's other things too, right? Who's got an idea of something else that might impact how much producers want to produce other than price?
Resources it takes to make.
Right. The inputs, right? Or raw materials. Can you get them? How expensive are they? Right? That's a very important part. Probably the biggest input is wages, right? How much do you have to pay people to work? Right? That's a very important part of supply. Technology, right? Innovation. We'll come back and talk about these things in a minute, but just like demand, there's multiple things that impact what the supply of a good is. So we could think about a supply schedule. Let's think about a producer of beer. And once again, they have a quantity supplied and a price. And let's say at a price of $2, they want to produce 1. Okay, just kind of making up some numbers here. So as price goes up, now the producer wants to pay, is willing to produce more. So if we do this graphically, what would this look like? I won't sketch it out very carefully, but what we see is a supply curve. And now there's a positive relationship between price and the quantity supplied. The key to all of this, though, once again, is ceteris paribus, all else equal. So the only thing that's changing here is price. Okay, the only thing that's changing here is price. Technology, price of inputs, right? None of that is changing. The only thing that's changing is price. And so what we have here is that firms supply more when the price goes up. Right? And we call that the law of supply. Just like there's a law of demand, there's a law of supply, which says that quantity supplied rises as price rises. Why? Because when the price goes up, firms' profits go up, all else equal. Now, listen, I cannot stress to you enough, though, the importance of this all else equal. Because in the real world, do we have all else equal all the time? No, of course not. Of course not, right? In other words, in the real world, all else is not necessarily equal, right? once again, we've been talking about COVID here. I mean, just think about COVID. If you remember at the beginning of this crisis, masks were hard to find. And in fact, the price of masks on Amazon went sky high. Does that mean that firms could just start producing more masks? No. The problem is they couldn't, because they literally did not have the inputs or the know-how to make them. It took them a period of time to collect the inputs and to, build the factory and to collect the know-how to be able to do it. So just saying price goes up doesn't mean immediately that firms are going to supply more, right? That there's actually a process here. And, you can think about a situation where sometimes firms said, yeah, the price went up, but it still doesn't make sense for me. Because when I think about all the costs I'm going to have to incur to get into these markets, maybe I don't want to do it, right? But in general, we like to think that as price goes up, profits go up. So that's a change in quantity supplied. So if the price goes up, quantity goes up, right? And that's an increase in quantity supplied. Right, an increase in quantity supplied. Now, the question, just as before with demand curves, is what happens when something other what happens when something other than price changes? Well, this is going to be a shift in supply. When you have a new supply curve. So if something other than price changes, then that creates a shift in supply. Things such as inputs. For instance, let's think about this example. What happens if there's an increase in energy prices? That's an important input into the production of most goods and services. What would happen to supply of beer, right? Here we're talking about the market for beer. So now energy costs more. It costs more to run the machines. It costs more to deliver the beer. So the price of making beer has gone up. What's going to happen to supply of beer? Is it going to increase or decrease?
Sorry, did you say the price of inputs increased for beer?
Yes. So
So the price,
Yeah.
the price of beer would increase because they need to, make even.
Okay, but it's not the price. It's not the price of beer that is causing higher energy prices. It's higher energy prices. That's what's shifted. That's what's changed. So when there's higher energy prices, that then shifts our curve, right? It's something other than price that has changed. Does supply for beer go up or does it go down?
Where'd it
It goes
go?
It goes down, right? What it means is that now at every price, firms want to produce less beer than they did before. How do we graph that? Which way does this curve move if it's a decrease in supply?
Left.
Left. Yes. And that looks wrong. All right. So probably one of the most common mistakes that students new to supply and demand make is getting confused which way a supply curve moves, right? So a decrease in supply is actually a shift in your supply curve to the left, right? A shift in your supply curve to the left. And if you ever forget that, just think, well, at the same price, which supply curve is going to have lower quantity? That's the lower supply curve, right? So this red one is lower than the black one because at that price, you get less quantity. Okay? So in this case, you would expect higher energy prices to reduce the supply of beer, right? Likewise, we could think of any number of inputs, whether it's the cost of hops or wages. You know, most goods have hundreds of thousands of different inputs that go into them, even something as relatively simple as beer. And so increase in any of these inputs could potentially shift the supply of beer. What are some other things? Well, you know, once again, it's hard to get an inclusive list of everything that could shift supply. But here's some of the more common ones. Changes in technology. Changes in technology can definitely change supply curves. Because what they do is most changes in technology involve changes in the cost of production, right? Changes in the cost of production. So let's think about an example where there's some improvement in technology that makes it cheaper to produce beer. Excuse me, I was sneezing. Sorry about that. So here we have an increase in technology that makes it cheaper to produce beer. What's going to happen to our supply curve?
It'd shift right, wouldn't it?
Shifts right because it's an increase in supply, right? So now at every price, this firm is going to be willing to produce more because it's cheaper to produce. And so in this case, you'd expect the supply curve to go up. One final example of something that might shift supply, just like a change in the number of buyers shifted demand. Something that changes the number of sellers could change supply. For instance, this is often what happens when patents expire, right? So patents on things such as a prescription drug. So hopefully you're all familiar with what a patent is. A patent basically gives the holder of that patent a monopoly right on the good. And you know, why would we give monopoly rights? Well, the theory is you give a monopoly right because the lure of profits encourages firms to spend a lot of money on research and development to create new innovation. So most patents last between 17 and 21 years when you get them. What happens when they expire? Well, then that means that anybody then can use the idea for free. And so, you know, those of you probably are familiar enough with generic medicines, generic drugs. What's a generic drug? Well, a generic drug is just a medicine in which the patent has expired. And what that means is that anybody then can go and produce it. And so what happens when the patent expires? A whole bunch of firms then jump into the market and start to produce it. What happens to supply? Oops. Sorry, that's a really bad graph. Do that from that. Not much better. Supply goes up because now more firms can produce. Right? No longer restricted to just having a monopolist produce. Once again, when we talk about supply, the biggest confusion is a change in supply versus a change in quantity supply. What's a change in quantity supplied? A change in price. And it's a movement along a supply curve, as opposed to a change in supply, which is a change in something other than price. And this shifts our supply curve. So that's the basics of the demand curves and supply curves. Who's got a question? Anybody have any questions?
Can you scroll up just a little bit?
Yes. This far?
Yeah, I was just trying to see number 3's graph.
Oh, right. So when the patent expires, there's an increase in the number of suppliers, and so the supply curve shifts to the right.
All right, thank you.
Okay, now for the moment you've all been waiting for. We've talked about demand. We've talked about supply. We need to put them together to make a market. A market is where supply and demand comes together. Remember what we are assuming here. We're assuming a perfectly competitive market. Right? We are assuming a perfectly competitive market. What does that mean? Anybody remember from this morning? What's a perfectly competitive market again?
So does that mean all all competitors have an equal chance in the market? There's no like monopolies or?
Well, that's an implication of a perfectly competitive market, but what actually needs to be true about a market for it to be perfectly competitive?
Homogeneous goods, lots of buyers and sellers, and everyone is a price taker.
Right. Right, homogeneous goods, meaning the goods are pretty much all the same. Lots of buyers and sellers, and everybody's a price taker.
Can you elaborate on the word assume, what you mean by that?
Well, in the example that we're going to talk about here, we are assuming that we have a perfectly competitive market. So what I mean about this is obviously not a good assumption for every single good, but for this case that we're going to talk about, we're going to assume we have a perfectly competitive market, right? So you might think about the market for corn. I think I used this example this morning, right? We're in Iowa, so let's talk about feed corn. we have price and quantity, we have supply of corn, and we have demand for corn. Now let's talk about what the market equilibrium is here. Now, first off, let's be clear, what do we mean by equilibrium? Equilibrium is a point where no one has an incentive to change what they're doing. That's what economists mean by an equilibrium. An equilibrium is where nobody has an incentive to change what they're doing. In a perfectly competitive market, in a perfectly competitive market, the equilibrium occurs at the price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Why? Because it's perfectly competitive. Okay? It's perfectly competitive. I want to emphasize to you, though, this is not an equilibrium of every kind of market. Not every market is going to have quantity supplied equal quantity demanded. That may not be an equilibrium in some markets, and we'll come back and talk about this, but in a perfectly competitive market, it will be. In other words, to go back to our graph, where's the equilibrium price? Right there. The equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity is right where supply and demand meets. In other words, what we get here is the market clears. In other words, everything that's produced is sold, right? If you actually think about what this means right there, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Everything that's produced is sold in a perfectly competitive market. Why? Because the price adjusts to make it that way. The price adjusts to make it that way. In a perfectly competitive market, that's what's going to happen. So let me try to convince you of this, right? And basically, the proof of this, not that this is a real proof, but the approach I'm going to take to prove this to you is to kind of take the counter example. What happens if we don't have equilibrium? Like, for instance, what happens if we have a surplus where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded? So let's say we have our market here, and here's demand, and here's supply. And that's the price that's needed to clear the market, right? P star and Q star are what are needed to clear the market. But for whatever reason, price is up here. The price is way up here, where quantity supplied is much bigger than quantity demanded. Can this be an equilibrium? Bradley, I see you shaking your head. No, it can't be an equilibrium. Why can't that be an equilibrium?
Since there's so much supply and the demand is so low that there's going to be all that extra stuff just kind of sitting around for whatever is like on the market.
Right. And so producers are going to have an incentive to get rid of that surplus, right? How do they get rid of the surplus?
By lowering prices.
By lowering prices. And notice what happens here. Cutting price does two things. Cutting price reduces quantity supplied, but it also increases quantity demanded. So when the price goes down, it's increasing quantity demanded and it's reducing quantity supplied. So at the lower price, producers want to produce less, but buyers want to buy more. And this process keeps on going until the price gets driven back to that equilibrium point at which it stops. Okay? So that's what's going to happen in a perfectly competitive market. That's what's going to happen in a perfectly competitive market, is that price is going to get driven down and those surpluses will disappear. Will that necessarily happen in a monopolistic market? No, right? Like at some level, Apple doesn't care if the market clears. Apple might be thinking they're a price setter, right? They get to set what prices are. They might think it could be their advantage. Actually, it's probably not going to be their advantage. Well, let me put it this way. They might think it's in their advantage to set the price higher than what clears the market because they might get some extra profits in that. But in a perfectly competitive market, nobody controls the price. And so everybody acting in their self-interest is going to drive the price down and drive it back toward equilibrium. What happens, let's work through another example. What happens if we have a shortage? A shortage is when quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. So there's the price that clears the market. But now price is down here. So quantity demanded is way up there, but quantity supplied is way down here. So notice that demand is much bigger than supply here. We have a shortage. What's going to happen in this case?
Prices go up.
Prices are going to get driven up, right? And what happens when prices get driven up? Supply
Demand goes down.
And demand, right? Or I'm sorry, supply goes up because the higher prices encourage more production. But demand goes down. And that moves, the higher prices move us back toward equilibrium. So I've been talking about this like for the market for corn, but the thought just struck me that maybe there's a better perfectly competitive market that you all might be more familiar with, not in Mount Vernon, but if any of you live in cities and you've ever been subject to Uber and Uber surge pricing, right? Have most of you done Uber? A number of you done Uber, right? Raise your hands. I see a couple of hands. So what happens during periods of high demand at Uber? What do they do?
Prices go up.
Prices go up. And why do prices go up? Because first off, it reduces demand. Many people say, oh, I'll just ride the bus. But also it encourages more Uber drivers to get on the road, right? So basically what Uber does is when they see a shortage of Ubers, they start raising the price. Why? Because they're trying to raise quantity supplied and lower quantity demand and get you back to the equilibrium price, the market clearing price. Likewise, what happens during periods of, low demand? Well, then the price falls. And when the price falls, that reduces supply, but that also encourages demand and moves us once again back to the market equilibrium. So Uber, for those of you who spend a lot of time looking at it, you can actually see supply and demand at work, right? You can actually see supply and demand at work. Well, Uber is basically using what's called surge pricing, but surge pricing is just a fancy word for pricing, right? That's what markets do. By changing the price, they're trying to create incentives that get us to market equilibrium. This idea that markets work is one of the most radical ideas in the history of humanity, right? It really is, right? Markets do what's best for society when they're perfectly competitive. That P star and Q star are the best for society. They are the societal's best outcomes. You can't do better than P star and Q star. And what I mean by better is if you raised price, some people would benefit, but other people would lose. But if you look at the maximum benefit to society, it's maximized when prices get to equilibrium. The equilibrium price and quantity maximize social welfare. Here's the key thing. What got us to that socially maximized outcome? Did we need a boss that tell us what the price and quantity are? Is there somebody out there directing traffic and saying, oh, prices have got to go up? No, no. The beautiful thing about this is that there is no one in charge, right? It's everyone, individuals, acting in their own self-interest. Individuals acting in their own self-interest end up doing what's best for society. And I cannot tell you how radical an idea this is in the course of human history. Because throughout most of human history, it was assumed that we need somebody to tell people what to do, right? That what happens if we let people act in their own self-interest? We'll just go kill each other, right? That basically we needed somebody to govern us in all aspects of life, somebody to tell us what to do, a monarch, right? A position of power, right? For those of you who have taken some philosophy classes, you might have read Thomas Hobbes, right? Who talked about the Leviathan, right? The Leviathan is this big monster who's out there. The monster is government, and we needed a government that essentially was powerful enough to make sure that we didn't kill each other, but wasn't so powerful that it killed us, right? So that was really the way that humans thought about the way to organize themselves, is we needed really somebody to tell us what to do. Then along came Adam Smith, who is, rightly regarded as the father of economics. And Adam Smith, anybody know the book he wrote? Jeopardy fans?
Wealth of Nations.
Wealth of Nations, thank you.
Invisible.
Exactly, right? The Wealth of Nations. And in it, Adam Smith talks about the invisible hand of the marketplace. And what is that invisible hand? Prices. Prices are the invisible hand. Prices give people incentives that then change their actions. What happens if we produce too little of a good? Prices go up. That creates incentives to produce more of the good. Nobody has to tell a firm to produce more or to produce less. The price mechanism does it, right? So that's what Smith meant by the invisible hand of the marketplace, right? The invisible hand of the marketplace is not the visible hand of government or the visible hand of a regulator, but it is the power of prices and markets to get us to socially optimal outcomes. And so this is really a radical idea in human history, right? The idea of individualism is closely wrapped up in this idea of Adam Smith. That really you let give individuals the freedom to do what they want to do. It's not going to it's giving government the power, not only might not get you to the best outcome, it might actually keep you from getting to the best outcome. And so this is the idea that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, the idea of laissez-faire, right? And laissez-faire is French for basically limited government. Actually, I think laissez-faire technically or literally means hands off, right? Hands off. But this idea of limited government, that government is as likely to screw things up and create the wrong incentives as it is to create the good, the best incentives. So this is the argument for markets. The argument for markets is that when people are allowed to act in their own self-interest, we end up doing what's best for society, not because we start out trying to do what's best to society, but because acting in our own self-interest actually creates the conditions by which society as a whole is as well off as it can possibly be. Now, having said that, having talked about the persuasiveness of Adam Smith's ideas here, let's be clear that this is based on the assumption of perfect competition. What happens if markets are not perfectly competitive? What if markets are not perfectly competitive? Well, then we can find many circumstances where markets fail. And when markets fail, there might possibly be a role for government. Okay, so the laissez-faire argument, let's be clear, is persuasive under some fairly strict assumptions about the way that the world works. But if the world doesn't work in that way, then laissez-faire may not get you to the socially optimal outcome, right? And of course, a lot of discussion over the last 200 years in economics has been exactly this. How competitive markets are they? Or how competitive are markets? And when they're not competitive, when they're not perfectly competitive, how can government intervene to prevent market failure, right? So, you know, we'll talk about this more as the class goes on, but just I kind of want to give you a heads up that, let's be clear, not all economists believe in laissez-faire and, you know, as small a government as possible and just let markets do whatever they want, right? I mean, yes, markets can be very powerful forces for good, but that doesn't mean that they always work, right? And so, you know, to be an economist doesn't mean that you're always for free markets. It means you understand when markets can work and when markets need help, right? And so that's a lot of what goes on in economics as we go forward in this class. And for those of you who take more economics classes, you'll come back to this question of what is the role of government and when does laissez-faire work and when doesn't it, again and again and again and again. Let's work through a couple of problems together. And then I think what I want to do is I'm going to break you into some groups and give you a couple of problems to work on together in small groups, and then we'll kind of come back and report to each other. But before I break into small groups, I want to maybe work through a couple of problems together, kind of problems that I'm likely to ask you on the quiz tomorrow, okay? So before we work through these problems, let's just step back a moment, and I want to talk carefully about how do you analyze a supply and demand problem. Okay. And so the kind of problems that we're going to work on here in a couple of minutes, I really want to encourage you for each of these problems to think through 4 steps, right? Think through 4 steps. And as you get better at it, you don't have to kind of think step 1, step 2, but at least to begin with, think through doing each of these 4 steps in order. First step. You should identify the market that you're talking about. Be very clear about what the market is that you're talking about. Okay, is it the market for corn? Is it the market for beer? Is it the market for Uber drives? Second, you want to think about, does the supply curve or does the demand curve or do both shift? Okay, does supply shift? Does demand shift? Do both shift? In what direction does this shift take place? So think about whether you're talking about supply or demand or both, and think about which direction the shift has to take place. And then point 4, always remember, A shift in demand leads to a change in quantity supplied, and vice versa. In other words, if there's a shift in demand, it's going to lead to a movement along your supply curve. A shift in demand leads to a movement along your supply curve. Okay? So, probably the best way to get a feel for what I'm talking about in each of these steps is let's do a couple of problems. And as I said, let's do a couple of problems together. And then I'm going to break you into small groups and we'll do a couple of problems separately. Okay, so problem number 1. I should call it, it's not really completely a vaccine. I'm going to call it cocktail, right? It's a medicine that significantly reduces the virus count in your bloodstream. It doesn't actually prevent AIDS in the same way that a true vaccine does, but you guys know what I mean, right? Hopefully you know what I mean. How did the discovery of the AIDS cocktail impact the market for condoms? Okay, let me give you a couple of seconds. Get out a piece of paper and a pen. And like I said, I'm just going to give you like a minute. Sketch out an answer to this for me. And then we'll come back here in a second and talk about it. All right, I'm going to go grab my book. I'll be back in a minute. Okay. Everyone kind of sketch out an answer? Okay, so let's think about this. First part, what's the market? Anybody? What's the
When the
market?
supply and demand come together.
Yes, but in what specific market though are we talking about?
The
Condom
market.
Right, the market for condoms. Okay, market for condoms. And so we have demand and we have supply, and we always begin in equilibrium. So let's just assume that the market is in equilibrium because we have a perfectly competitive market. Okay, now there's this AIDS vaccine, right? Not quite a vaccine, but close. Or at least it's very effective treatment. So what does that impact? Demand or supply?
Demand.
Demand, yeah. Why would you say demand?
Because it could be seen as a substitute.
It could, right? It could be seen as a substitute, yeah. Or I guess I would maybe better say that it's really a reduction in the usefulness of condoms, right? I mean, condoms are still useful for the prevention of other diseases, but they're not as necessary for the reduction in preventing AIDS, right? So, I mean, however you want to think about it, this is probably a reduction in the usefulness of condoms. And so as a result, what should happen? demand should go down. And our demand curve shifts this way. But remember step 4. When demand shifts, what happens to supply? There's a movement, there's a change in quantity supplied as we move along the supply curve to the new equilibrium point. So notice here that as price goes down, we move along the supply curve to get to this new equilibrium point. And so now our new equilibrium involves lower equilibrium price and lower equilibrium quantity.
So I'm a little confused. Why did the demand for condoms go down? What was the logic behind that?
So now condoms are not as useful as they were before, right? Because you're not as afraid of getting AIDS, quite frankly, right? Because now there's this fairly effective treatment. And so before you could think about using using condoms as a life-saving device, it has become less life-saving, right? So the demand falls, and when the demand falls, that reduces price and it reduces quantity.
But isn't like condom also like really like important also like, to prevent it, like to prevent yourself from getting AIDS or like any other diseases? Maybe I'm confused.
So we're not saying that condoms are not useful. We're saying that they're less useful than they were. Okay, so that's an important distinction. Still useful. I would still recommend them, right? But they are less useful than they were before. Right?
Are you saying like basically specifically in regards to just AIDS for this?
No, in general. Because a big part of the usefulness of condoms was protecting AIDS, right? So you can actually see this if you actually look at the data for and what happened to condoms. When were condoms most prevalently used in the United States? In the 1980s, right? Condom usage before and after is actually much lower than it was in the 1980s and early 90s, right? So a lot of the demand for condoms has been driven by AIDS, right? Or was driven by AIDS. Let's think of another example here. So here's the second example. Why has the price of computers consistently dropped? At a constant quality, meaning holding quality constant, the price of computers have consistently dropped since the 1980s.
Moore's law.
Moore's law, exactly. What is Moore's law?
Processing power increases exponentially over time.
Yeah, right. Specifically, I think that computing power doubles every 6 months or 18 months. Yeah, right. But anyway, yeah, you've really hit the head on the nail on the head. It's technology, right? We have seen a consistent increase in technology power. And so what has this increase in technology done if we're talking about the market for computers? Does that shift supply or demand?
Supply.
It primarily impacts supply, right? And does it increase supply or decrease?
Increase.
Increase. And remember, an increase in supply is shifting our supply curve to the right. So when supply goes up, what then happens along our demand curve? We move along our demand curve. Right? That as supply goes up, that pushes down price, and lower prices increase the quantity demanded. So we move from this old equilibrium to the new equilibrium. And what's true in our new equilibrium? We have lower prices and higher quantities. Lower prices and higher quantities. And so that, I think, matches very well with what we've seen happen in the market for computers since the 1980s, right? Is that for a constant computing power, right? For a constant computing power, computers have gotten exponentially cheaper, exponentially cheaper. And as they've gotten cheaper, what's happened to our use of computers? They've gone up, right? We use more computers at lower prices, largely driven by technology, right? Largely driven by technology. Does that make sense? Okay, let's do a hard one. This one's trickier. Oops, not the US. Let's think about mad cow disease in Britain in the 1990s. You all know what mad cow disease is? Heard of mad cow disease? Maybe. So mad cow disease was a virus that infected cattle, and it basically infected their brains. That's why it's called mad cow, because the cows would act in a bizarre way. But if you ate a cow that had mad cow disease, you could die, right? So eating a cow with mad cow disease is potentially fatal, okay? How do you get rid of mad cow disease? How did Britain get mad cow disease out of their population? They had to kill all their cattle, right? They had to basically start over. Okay, so what's the market we're talking about?
Cattle.
Market for cattle? I think in this case, let's talk about the market for beef, right? Because that's what most people buy cattle for. I think we can be a little bit more specific. In general, we have cattle for beef. And let's also be clear here. We're not talking about in the globe, but we're talking specifically about Britain because they were the most impacted by this. Okay, so here we are. Market in the UK before mad cow. Now we have mad cow. What shifts, supply or demand?
Supply, obviously,
Yeah,
but maybe also demand. I don't know if people are like afraid to eat beef after this craziness.
yeah, I would be pretty afraid to eat beef, wouldn't you? Yeah, I think you're right, Ruthie. I think both of these things changed, right? This is clearly a reduction in supply because they basically had to kill cattle. But this also very likely reduced demand because you could have a hamburger and die. And so here's a case where probably both supply and demand shifted at the same time. So if we started off here, supply shifted to the left and demand goes down. Now, here's the tricky part. Here's our new equilibrium. At this new equilibrium, what happened to quantity?
It decreased.
Yeah, pretty clearly it decreased, right? What happened to price?
Decreases.
It depends.
Right, that's the better answer, right? The better answer is we actually don't know. It depends. It depends on how big the change in demand is relative to the change in supply. Price could stay the same, or price could go up, or price could go down. The better answer is it depends. It's indeterminate. Right? We just don't know without getting more information. Because if you think about what happens, the decrease in demand reduces price, but the decrease in supply increases price. So which of those effects are more important? We don't know. We don't know. Any guesses, though, what actually happened to prices? You think they went up or they went down?
They probably went up, maybe. They might have to like kind of like, or actually no, it probably went down because maybe it's like the public might have still been like afraid to eat it, but it's kind of like, it's kind of a way to have more customers come in and buy it. That makes sense, because if the price is still high, it might be another reason for people to not buy it. So
No, I think
maybe that's my.
I think it goes up.
Yeah, your intuition at the beginning, I think, was right. Right? That, believe it or not, mad cow disease didn't really reduce demand that much. As crazy as that sounds, people really like hamburger. They're willing to die for it. Demand did go down, but it did not go down by nearly as much as supply fell. And so quantity clearly went down, but actually the price of beef in the UK went up. Supply did not go down to zero, though. Why? Because you could still import beef from abroad, right? So most of the remaining supply of beef in Britain was imported from France and other places that did not have mad cow disease, the US. So yeah, mad cow disease is an interesting case study in how much people really like to eat hamburgers, right? Because people continued to eat hamburgers even though there was a period of time where it could kill you. And literally, it could kill you. And immediately kill you, not just kill you in the long run like hamburgers can do, right? So this is a tricky one, right? This is the tricky one. One of the things that happens when both demand and supply shift is that it's quite possible that either price or quantity is going to be indeterminate. In other words, you're just not going to be able to tell, right? You're not going to be able to tell what happens. You're going to need more information. Okay, how are we feeling about our competence with supply and demand? Good. Evan's giving me the rock on sign, right? I'm seeing some thumbs maybe drifting toward the middle. I know that we're after our 2 o'clock time limit. So if any of you have to go, that's fine. I understand. But why don't we? I do want to, just for 10 minutes or so, break you into small groups. Let me give you a problem to work on, and you can work on it in small groups, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So I'm still going to try to get you out of here by 2:30. I apologize that it's later than what I usually want to go in the afternoon, but this morning got screwed up. Okay, so for those of you who have your books, let's look at problem 1 at the end of chapter 3. This is on page 96. Okay. And so this problem says, a study by Yahoo revealed chocolate is the most popular flavor of ice cream. So for each of the following, indicate the possible effects on the demand and supply and the equilibrium price on the quantity of chocolate ice cream. So for these questions, your market is chocolate ice cream, okay? And then you're given 4 parts. Part A is a severe drought in the Midwest. Part B is doctors say that chocolate is good for you. Part C is a discovery of cheaper vanilla that lowers the price of vanilla ice cream. And part D is a new technology for mixing and freezing ice cream, okay? So I'm gonna break you randomly into groups here, and I'm gonna give you, let's say, probably between 5 and 10 minutes to work on this problem, okay? So you do that, and then we'll come back in and we'll talk about what we found, all right? Okay, so I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Hey, hon. Oops.
Mr. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. We're having trouble finding the problem.
Do you not have the book? It's on page 90.
I downloaded mine, and so did the other person in my group, and we're not able to find it.
So you can't find page 96?
No, not from the online version.
Okay.
Either of us.
At the end of chapter 3, it's problem 1. I don't know what else I can.
At the end of chapter 3?
At the end of chapter 3, problem 1.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll be calling you back in a minute or two, so.
Were the questions at the end of chapter 3 in the 5th edition or the 4th edition? Or do you know if there's a...
Well, it should be I believe it's the first question in either edition.
So I'm looking at, I have an online copy
Mm-hmm.
on my computer. I've got it open in front of me. And I'm looking at the end of it, and it says it's the 5th edition for me. But I'm just wondering if I don't have a good enough, like, it's not, I don't see that. My last question in the last section says, what accounts for the fact that before Uber's arrival, there were generally enough taxis available for everyone who wanted one?
Hmm. You're sure you're looking at the problems at the end of chapter 3?
There's one that says, check your understanding 3.4. And then after that little segment on the Uber stuff, it goes into 4, price controls and quotas, meddling with markets.
So are you sure I think you may not be in chapter 3. Yeah,
Maybe not. I mean, it's telling me I'm in chapter 3 because the headers are like, that was the title for chapter 4.
Mm-hmm.
But like when I'm looking at this stuff, this is talking about what we were talking about.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Next time I'll just read you the question.
Okay, thank you.
Question, sorry. Okay, so let's do these. So do I have any volunteers who want to kind of talk us through problem number 1? The problem 1A. So this is, remember, we're talking about the market for chocolate ice cream. And then 1A says there's a severe drought in the Midwest that causes dairy farmers to reduce the number of milk-producing cattle in their herds by a third. These dairy farmers supply cream that's used to manufacture chocolate ice cream. All right, so who would want to give a guess here? First off, we're talking about the market for chocolate ice cream, right? Okay, so do any groups want to have a spokesperson? And jump in here. What happens if there's a drought in the Midwest? Reduction in number of cattle.
I can go for 2-4.
Sure, sounds good.
So, this would be a reducing input capacity. So what would happen is supply would shift to the left, which would decrease the equilibrium quantity supplied, but increase the equilibrium price.
Right, correct, right, correct. So once again, just kind of walk through so everybody could hear. If you're cutting the number of cattle in the Midwest, that means you're really cutting the amount of milk, which means that the price of milk is going to go up, or the price of cream, right? So this is the increase in the price of an input. And so this will decrease supply. Supply, when it decreases, moves to the left. Notice that the shift in supply means that there's a movement along our demand curve. And what's true in our new equilibrium? Prices go up, quantity goes down. Good job. When you do a question like this, say for instance on the quiz tomorrow, please be careful. And I think particularly at the beginning, really write your work down, okay? In other words, tell me why you think supply or demand is shifting. You don't have to give me an essay, just a couple of words about why you think, exactly why you think supply or demand is shifting. Also, be clear as to which way price and quantity are moving, whether you want to put an arrow or if you want to put like Q1, Q2, P1, P2, right? In other words, just to make sure that I understand, that you understand what you're doing, okay? Sometimes for these questions, there can be alternative answers. Like, you know, I think you can answer them in different ways. And this one seems pretty straightforward, but sometimes you'll have questions that could be answered in a different way. And so that's why you want to tell me a little bit, right? Because once again, I'm open to alternative answers, right? Recognizing that in economics, there's often not just a single answer, but you have to explain to me what your thinking is, right? Because if it's different than mine, then it's hard for me to give you credit without actually hearing why you think what you think. All right, part B. A new report by the American Medical Association reveals that chocolate does in fact have significant health benefits. All right, anybody want to jump in and give us their idea about what would happen if the AMA gives approval to chocolate?
I could jump in. Yeah, so what we got for my group was that for since chocolate has health benefits, the demand would increase the equilibrium. So it would be a shift to the right.
Okay. Anybody disagree? Yeah, I think you're right, Michael. That seems pretty obvious, right? And this should increase the demand. In some sense, this is an increase in usefulness, right? Because now eating chocolate can cause you to live longer or help you live longer. So this would increase demand this way. What would happen to price? It goes up. Quantity goes up. And remember, we move along our we move along our supply curve to higher supply. Yeah, that seems pretty straightforward. Anybody have any questions about that one? Let's move on to part C here. Discovery of cheaper synthetic vanilla flavoring lowers the price of vanilla ice cream. Who wants to jump in on this one?
Demand would go down
Demand would go down, and why?
because there's a substitute.
Right, there's a decrease in the price of a substitute, right? I mean, vanilla ice cream has long existed, right? But now the price of vanilla ice cream goes down. And so when the price of a substitute goes down, you buy less of the substitute. You buy less of the other good. So in this case, demand goes down. Price would fall, quantity falls, and we move along our supply curve to get to that new equilibrium. Make sense to everybody? All right, in the interest of time, I'm just moving here kind of quickly because we're at our 2:30 limit. But quickly, a new technology for mixing and freezing ice cream lowers manufacturers' cost of producing chocolate ice cream. Anyone want to jump in on this one?
Supply would shift to the right.
Right, an increase in supply, right? Because this is essentially a new technology that have cut costs. And supply shifts to the right. What happens? Price goes down, quantity goes up, and we move along our demand curve from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium. All right, everyone. I wish we would have had time to do a couple more problems together, but you know, the problems at the end of the book, regardless of what edition you have, are good practice. You know, honestly, you can find 100 supply, thousands of supply and demand questions online too. So what I would suggest is, remember, we're having a quiz over supply and demand tomorrow morning at the end of class. So I would suggest you particularly for those of you who have not seen supply and demand, you review carefully what we talked about today, work through a couple of problems at the end of the text. We also will probably have a little bit of time before the quiz tomorrow to review for the quiz. All right. So if there's questions that any of you have about the quiz or any of the material, we can talk about those. And if we have some time, we will do like a problem or two to practice. Okay. We'll take the quiz at the end of class tomorrow morning. And it will be, like I said, a short quiz, no more than 20 minutes. So there's going to be a 20-minute time or limit on it. It's going to be kind of short answers and some problems. For those of you who are going to be online in the morning, I am going to send it to you in a Word document. And you're going to just stay on Zoom, right? Stay with the Zoom camera. And then you're going to fill out the Word document and send it back to me, okay? So for those of you who are taking it online, you might ask, how am I going to do graphs or things like that? You can do graphs and just take a picture and put the picture in your Word document if you can, and then send it back to me, right? Or you can carefully describe what's going on in words. I will also accept that. So instead of doing a graph, if you can carefully describe what's going on in words, then that would be okay too. All right? Okay, well, I'm sorry about going so late. We will not ordinarily go this late in the afternoon, but good luck tonight. If you have some questions, like I said, you can send me a quick email tonight. We'll also have a little bit of time to review for the quiz tomorrow, okay? All right, busy day, hectic day, but 1 of 18 done. So good job. All right, have a good evening, everybody.
Have a good one.
Thanks.
Thank you.